What is your best advice for creating a sense of verisimilitude and making the world feel real to the players? In other words, how can I encourage my players to roleplay more and engage with the content? So for those of you that don't know, verisimilitude is the experience in a story of making that story world feel real, at least temporarily. It's the feeling when you're in a D&D world and it feels like a real, tangible place and not a game world anymore. Now this is a hard question to answer because what brings about verisimilitude is different for each and every campaign, in my opinion. The best place to start with verisimilitude is making sure that the actions of your players have real, tangible, and lasting consequences. It can be as simple as if they blow off a quest for 2 weeks to go and save the blacksmith's daughter from the goblins, well, she's dead by the time they get around to it. Or perhaps the goblins have all moved on, and ideally with a party you do that once or twice in an entire campaign. And this will do enough so that for the remainder of the campaign, the players think of the world as a living, breathing place. Now, getting players to roleplay is its own can of worms. In this quote-unquote short Q&A, I can't get into a lot of granular detail, but let me give you 3 tips off the top of my head. 1, you need to facilitate a space where role-playing is acceptable. If your players feel like they're going to be judged or are uncomfortable, they're not going to be as willing to roleplay. 2nd, though, you need to encourage what you want to see in your campaign, so if a player roleplays, you need to give them real and tangible benefits. I don't just mean maybe lowering the DC of certain saves behind the scenes, but maybe a shopkeeper will give them a lower price because they like their attitude, or a persuasion check can just succeed, no save required. But giving players rewards for roleplay, tangible mechanical benefits, is usually better. And I want to make it clear that roleplaying also doesn't stop in combat. For instance, if the fighter goes about describing in a very particular way how they try and slash at a dragon's wings, they might get a small bonus to their attack roll or their damage. Little things like that go a long way in the minds of your players. The last tip I need to give to you is difficult though, because you need a world and a campaign worth role-playing in. Because even as an experienced DM and player, there are some campaigns where if I'm sitting there as a player, I might not be role-playing as much. This is because the world doesn't have a sense of verisimilitude, or I don't care about the NPCs around me, or the plot just isn't interesting me. I will still just try and put in effort because that's the kind of player I am, but I'm not going to be giving it my all. And for new players that don't roleplay as much, this will cause them to not roleplay any. Now, making likable NPCs in interesting worlds is a topic that we could literally talk about for hours, but high-level 40,000 foot view, making likable NPCs comes down to making characters that you actually like. Would you like to spend time with this NPC? Are there traits within this person that make them likable for you, that are redeeming? If the answer is yes and you're showing these likable traits, eventually the players are going to latch on to one of these characters. Interesting worlds are their own can of worms, but at the end of the day, the best thing that you can do is probably tying that world into the players' backstories or the campaign plot. Players will engage with your content if it is useful for them. That capital city that you made might be the coolest place in your world, but if it has no bearing on the players, then why do they care? Now, your second question is a bit more of a problem. I'm gonna call it a huge problem. Because one of the most important things you do in every game of a TTRPG is pay attention to your players. Your players are the entities that are moving and shaping your story. Missing entire chunks of your game is a massive problem. You're right, this will get easier the more you run games, but unless I know what your game is, I can't help you manage that workload. As the workload for a DM in a sandbox campaign and in a more linear campaign are two very different experiences. For right now, the best advice I can give is to throw out trying to be in character or being a voice actor or anything else if it is stopping you from paying attention to what your players are doing. That shit is vitally important, and you cannot be affording to miss that. If you go and watch my DMs Have to Prep video, I give what a minimal amount of DM prep looks like. If you do that minimal amount of prep before every session and have a plot web backing you up, you should be good. From there, you can just focus on paying attention to your players. So my advice is do the minimum prep, have a plot web behind you, and then slowly add in more as you improve as a DM. But dear God, do not neglect what your players are doing in-game. That is a cardinal sin of DMing. Next question though, did you ever try making a dungeon where your party only explored one part/layer, but a few levels later they find out there's a secret area, player, or part for a boss/mini boss or a hidden item? You see that in some games, but is it good or fun to do? Yeah, I've done this a few times before, but I don't recommend it being plot relevant, because there is just a large chance, unless you directly tell the players that there is a secret back in that dungeon, that they'll never find the secret, or even if you give them a clue that there's a secret in that dungeon, they might not remember that dungeon at all. Even then, going back to an empty dungeon, especially if you're making the party go room by room again, can be rather boring. It feels empty. Plus, at the pace that I particularly run my campaigns and my stories, players rarely double back on an area because there's just so much more to see and do. So is it good or fun? Maybe, depends on your game. D&D isn't a video game, I mean, despite what Baldur's Gate 3 might have you believe, and doubling back on old areas just doesn't feel as good as in a roguelike or a RPG game. Next up though, we got some rapid fire questions. Monk series, maybe. Right now on my Patreon, you can vote for the next class series that you want to see. This first vote is open to all tiers and it ends, I believe, the end of August. So if you want to see the Monk series sooner rather than later, then you can become a patron at any tier and vote for that. Next up, thoughts on having a rotating weather system with more severe weather affecting the battlefield with like limited sight, slowed movement, etc. I think those kind of systems are fine. I've used them before, and I don't think they added a lot to my games. In fact, sometimes a randomly generated or rotating weather system can feel kind of bad for players, because if you get a long stretch of bad weather, it just, well, feels bad. I tend to have my weather reflect the mood of a campaign. It's very gothic fantasy in that sort of style. If there's turmoil amongst the party while they're staying in an inn, it might be dark and stormy outside. Oh, they just defeated a powerful lieutenant of the BBEG, well, the next day when they return to town, it is bright and sunny, and it feels jovial. For me, in my campaigns, I use weather as a storytelling tool. It is a way to help set the mood of the game, or I can employ weather specifically to make more interesting combat encounters. I think there can be benefits to doing it randomly or having a rotating system, because then you never know what you're going to expect. But for me, that's just more on my plate that I constantly have to worry about, and I prefer to have that little bit of narrative control. Although on certain virtual tabletops like Foundry VTT, there are modules that allow you to have these rotating weather systems and they handle it for you. So that I would be much more receptive to, because it just handles the weather for me. Next up though, the Echo Knight is broken because it's badly written. One example of this is that the Echo is an object and the vast majority of AoEs only hit creatures. I just wanted to touch on this comment a bit, because for me these little quote-unquote problems aren't problems. As a DM, if a player brings this up, I just go, well, in this campaign world, the Echo is a creature. Can we all decide here if the Echo is a creature? It feels like a creature, right? Why wouldn't the fireball affect an Echo? And every single time the players agree, yeah, this is a kind of weird rule, it just feels like a creature, so we're all going to treat it as a creature. Now, that doesn't excuse bad or sloppy writing, but I think if you're trying to use this as a way to say that the Echo breaks the game, it's just a very, very simple fix. See, the strength for me of tabletop role-playing games is that you're not limited by code, you're limited by this arbiter that is the DM. This arbiter translates the rules in the world to the players. And during these edge cases or places where the game breaks down, the arbiter can correct the game. Unfortunately, in many circumstances, new or just frankly poor DMs use this power of arbitration to remove class features from certain classes like a rogue sneak attack, or to completely bypass entire portions of the game system in which the balancing of the game rests upon, like hit points. But if you have this weird idiosyncrasy that is threatening to break your game, like an Echo being an object, then you can just use your DM fiat and say, no, the object is a creature. It feels like a creature, and all of these spells here were written before the Echo Knight was a thing. The designers, or Matthew Mercer in this case, I think definitely did not think about the implications of calling an Echo an object, but you have and can correct it, usually with the consent of your players. I think that's the most important thing. Communication. If this is a problem, sit down with your players, talk it through, say why you think that this is a problem, and lay out a series of solutions. Usually communication solves every problem. Next up though, we're going to dive into a few questions surrounding my plot thread video. Like this one, awesome video, what software did you use? Or this one, was there a specific software? Or, yep, so a bunch of you were asking about what software I used. For that video, I used Photoshop, but you can use pretty much anything. And like I said a few times in the comments, mostly I just use a notebook. A plat web is just showing these visual connections. These days, more often than not, I don't actually need to see those visual connections. The bullet points are enough for me. I kind of make the plat web in my head because I have an understanding of how everything connects, just because I've been doing it for so long. If a plat web gets really big, I take a notebook or sometimes drafting paper and I just sketch it out. At the end of the day, I don't think the software or how you create the plot web really matters that much. It's just the technique of folding your plot points together to make a cohesive whole. Simply having an understanding of how your player backstories and campaign world fit together is very, very helpful. So however you visualize it, up to you. I guess there are mind map apps out there. I haven't used any of them, so I can't speak to how good they are, but feel free to try some out and see if they work for you. Next question, still on the plot web video, I find that some of my players prefer knowing the campaign premise before creating characters, so they have a starting point for character creation. How much do you tell the players about the premise of the campaign before they write their backstories? Would you tell them the theme, central tension? It seems a campaign premise would be hard to pin down before the backstories are created using this method. So for all of my campaigns, I give a small introduction document. This is to outline the central premise of the campaign while also talking about themes, what I'm expecting from backstories, timelines for the start of the campaign. Basically getting players all up to speed. Here, I'll actually walk through an introduction document right now. This will probably turn into a video eventually, just because I think introduction documents are a really good idea for most D&D campaigns. So this is an introduction document I did for a campaign titled Angelic Noir. It was a noir-style detective campaign based in my D&D world. And first thing is, I usually give my players 3 or 4 options for campaigns on what they want to play before giving them an introduction document. This is the campaign premise that a majority of players really wanted to play in. And the initial pitch for this campaign was simply that you are going to be investigating the deaths of multiple angels in the City of Thieves. Pretty simple stuff. Now, I start all of my introduction documents with a tag to draw players in. In this case, it is "The Angels Are Dying." This is eye-catching and specifically supposed to draw players into the general themes and activities of this campaign. After this, I give a few short paragraphs to introduce the general premise of the campaign. This usually isn't more than like 300 words. So here for Angelic Noir, I say, there is no more corrupt city than Vangan on the continent of Ramesh. The favorite home of raiders, thieves, and other cutthroats, the city survives on crime. Basically, this whole paragraph here is setting up the setting of the campaign. Players know that they are going to be playing in a city of thieves that's going to be gritty, it's going to be a little bit darker. Things like law and order really don't exist here. Now, paragraph 2, we start getting into the heart of the campaign. Still, the deaths of 3 angels, their bodies discarded all over the city, is alarming. It is perhaps more alarming that the 3 previous detective companies that got assigned to this case have all gone missing. Only fools or the truly desperate would take up such a case. Alright, we know how this campaign's gonna start. The bodies of multiple angels were found around this city. Additionally, other detective companies that have tried to look into this have all gone missing. Who the hell would take up this case? Well, that's paragraph 3. Your detective company is truly that desperate. In its short 2 years of existence, you have been hired on a total of 3 cases. You've solved them all, but now the gold is beginning to run out. Without another case in sight, Jarl Skor Barris's offer is one you cannot afford to pass up, with the next morning bringing your meeting with Skor in a musty dive bar in one of the better parts of town. Your company hurtles towards danger you could have never predicted. Alright, now we know how the party got together. This is a campaign where the party is starting as part of a detective company. Or at least that is the assumed starting point. And the players know that the start of the campaign is going to be them meeting with their employer to be given this task. And then I usually like to throw in a final paragraph, which is just to reinforce the vibes I'm going for this campaign. Dark forces swirl around Vangan. The City of Thieves now becomes entwined in a mad plan to change its very nature. It is the year 701 AR when zealotry seeds itself within Vangan. Now it is up to you and your party to navigate this Angelic Noir. See, we're instilling things like being wrapped up in these plots, these mad plans, changing the nature of a city. We have things like zealotry involved. All of this helps my players to construct characters, but we go even deeper. After those paragraphs where I describe the central tension in the campaign, I tackle the campaign in a more meta level. I always have a paragraph where I say, in this campaign. Basically here, I'm setting out how I am trying to construct this campaign. These are the facets of the central tension and the theme that make this campaign work, or that will make this campaign work. So for instance, I say we will explore the city of Vangan and other cities throughout the land of Breoa. That is the country that they're in. You will be in the center of a complex web of clues that will slowly untangle itself. It's a campaign where the mystery is the central part of the plot web. And I even say this, unraveling this mystery in all its facets is core to Angelic Noir. However, in the following sentences, I make it clear that there is still going to be combat in this campaign. At least combat every 2 or 3 sessions. Now, this is a weekly campaign that played for about 3 hours every week. So basically, I was saying there's going to be a combat every 6 to 9 hours of in-game time. So if you're running a character built for combat, keep that in mind. At the very end of this paragraph, though, I talk about that whatever the case, you can solve this mystery your way. You find the necessary clues, question suspicious people, investigate new locations, and piece together why these angels died. Here, I am signaling that the main conceit of this campaign is that the party themselves will be working through the mystery. This campaign isn't designed to be linear, but it's not completely a sandbox either. While the mystery is supremely important, and likely most of the campaign is going to be revolving around that central mystery, you can handle that mystery and the fallout however you want. Next paragraph though, I always talk about the themes that I have in mind for this campaign. Things that I think are going to be very relevant given how the general framework of the campaign is structured. So I flat out tell my players, mystery, political intrigue, moral corruption, the cost of change, and family. All very big themes that they're going to be wrestling with, or at least the NPCs in the world around them are going to be wrestling with. They can wrestle with whatever other themes they want to, but when I'm constructing NPCs, situations, or a narrative feel, these are the things that I'm going to be drawing from. So initially, if you want a character that really feels like they are connected to the themes of this campaign, you can base your own themes off of these. Now, this is not saying that these are the only themes that are going to be present, or that you can't go and offshoot onto different themes that are completely your own. However, if you want to start somewhere, this is where I'm starting. And you can see this in action in Caden, who is from this campaign and is one of the character backstories I use for the plot web video. I mean, literally, let's just count the number of themes that Caden's backstory touched on. Mystery? Yes. Political intrigue? Yes. Moral corruption? Yes. The cost of change? Yeah. Touched on that pretty heavily, and family and bloodlines, of course. But the player also brought many of their own themes into the campaign. In the next paragraph though, I set out how the campaign is kind of structured, whether it's more sandbox or linear. And it's here what I basically outline what I've told all of you. There is a central narrative that is propelling the campaign forward, and essentially, the players will always have an idea of something that they can do next. However, very specifically saying that players can make their own choices and completely disregard the central narrative, because it's not a railroaded experience. However, if I'm doing my job correctly, and this is something I feel very strongly about, you should want to follow that central narrative, that main story. I am not going to force you or railroad you into trying to figure out this central mystery. However, I'm going to make that central mystery so tantalizing and all the clues so interesting that you want to figure it out. After discussing all that though, I gave a time frame for this campaign. I think it's a really good idea whenever possible to give an outline of when you think a campaign will end, and also what level that you're expecting the party might get to. So very openly here I say, this is not intended to reach epic levels. This campaign was designed to be shorter. And overall, the time frame I gave for this campaign was basically like 6 to 9 months it's going to take for us to get through this. At least that's what I was predicting, and also kind of saying, you know, if we're starting to get to that area of time, then you know that the campaign is probably going to start winding down. If it's February 2023, are we going to take 2 or 3 sessions for you to travel to the next town over? Probably not. We might have a skill challenge to get there, but we're all expecting the campaign to be done soon. That way we can I'll start on our next campaign and try to go through that backlog of characters we have created. And remember here, if this introduction document sounds like you would never want to play in this campaign, cool. The players in this campaign wanted to play in this over other campaigns. They enthusiastically agreed that they wanted to play this campaign over other campaigns. We had session 0, we went through all those steps, and they wanted to play Angelic Noir. That's the point of the introduction document and session 0. Other groups that I run for would have hated this campaign, and that's why we have the introduction document. That way, if the players feel strongly that actually we don't want to play in this campaign, can we play another? Then we can have that conversation without being 5 or 6 sessions in to this campaign. And after that, I have sections within my introduction document talking about character creation. For instance, the party here is starting at level 3 and they need a reason to be a part of the detective company. Additionally, I tell them that their character will get a free feat. This is something that I usually do because Variant Human is so strong. A lot of my players want the free feat so that they can further build their character. And so they might have an idea for a Tiefling character but go Variant Human just because they want the free feat. So I toss the free feat in there just to make sure that they can build whatever character they want, not feel limited by the race restrictions. And I also give them a custom magic item. This is pretty standard in my campaigns. I really like it when characters have a signature magic item that grows with them over the course of a campaign. Then the rest of the introduction document is talking about backstories, tips for backstory creation, some questions that should be answered in a backstory. This helps me create the plot web and gives players a jumping off point if they have trouble starting backstories. Because quite honestly, when you are just dropped in the middle of nowhere and just told make a backstory, that can be very difficult. Now, if you have a general character idea in mind and start answering these questions, well, that can make the backstory process all the more easy. So basically, that's the information I give my players before the game starts. For the most part, at least this is the knowledge that comes specific with this campaign. I have an absolutely huge campaign world and a bunch of lore documents, so my players know a lot of additional world lore. Things like gods and cities and nations. But a lot of the things in the plot web, I have them figure out in-game. Because then there are even mysteries that the player doesn't know about themselves. There are surprises. I hate it when I'm a player and I know everything about my character as I'm playing the game. I want the DM to surprise me. I think that's kind of my philosophy on DMing. You should run a game that you yourself would like to play in as a player. Because if you would like to play in the game, you can probably find players that would also like to play in the game. Within reason. I mean, there are RPG horror stories out there. But generally, that's my philosophy about giving players information. I give them what they need to know up front. There's a ton of world lore that they can look into if they really want to know those things. And there are secrets and nuances that are going to be uncovered within the campaign as they play through it. Next up though, I wonder if you could describe how you'd make a Circle of Wildfire Druid. Already did. Check out this video right here. But TLDR, I suppose I'd pump Wisdom, choose a race that fit my backstory, and go 20 levels in the subclass. I'd pick spells that do fire damage and healing spells. And that's pretty much it. The Circle of Wildfire Druid is so good that as long as you have a high wisdom score, everything else just kind of falls into place. I'm also going to answer another question here about druids. Have you ever thought about making a druid subclass that wild shapes into magical plants rather than beasts, or can turn default nature like trees, bushes into magical ones? I'll be honest, not really, just because of how bad the plant creature type is right now. I would rather reflavor the Circle of the Moon Druid into turning into these weird plant-like monstrosities rather than using the actual plant creature type stat blocks. Because a Shambling Mound is CR 5, and if we're going off of Moon Druid builds and rules, then you're only going to be able to turn into something like a Shambling Mound when you're, 15th level? Or something close to that? So yeah, I haven't really thought about it. I just don't think it would be a lot of fun to play, or I would need to completely make new plant creature stat blocks that would work with the subclass. And I'm a proponent of reflavoring things whenever you can, so I would recommend to a player just reflavor the Moon Druid and you're probably good to go. Next up though, what are your thoughts on the West Marches kinda campaigns? Do you like? How would you run it? Would a BBEG be behind it all, or just exploration? And how would you handle traveling and returning to base? I love West Marches campaigns. I'm running one right now. The campaign name is called Bedlam. It's been going on for about a year, and it's fantastic. I highly recommend West Marches campaigns, especially if you have large groups of people that want to play Dungeons & Dragons with you, or any TTRPG for that matter, with finicky schedules that make it hard for you to all get together, or when you do get together, the groups are so big that it's hard to actually have fun playing the game. I'm talking about groups with 7 or 8 plus players. Again, this is a topic for an entire video. But basically, running a West Marches campaign is all about building up to a specific goal in my eyes, or an event. Like for a West Marches style campaign, I would have multiple antagonists, but there wouldn't be one big bad evil guy necessarily. But there would be many different villains working towards one goal. For instance, in the current West Marches style campaign, all the groups are trying to stop the coming of an ancient elder evil. That is the goal of the campaign, and every single time players sit down for a session, they are slowly making incremental progress towards stopping that threat. Now, making that progress comes in many different ways. It comes in one-off side missions to get more levels, get more gold, or get new magic items. Missions to save an ally, missions to defeat an enemy. I think this style also lends to multiple DMs as well, because you can pretty much run whatever you want, because if you give any sort of reward, it's still going to be helping towards that final challenge down the road. Hopefully you see what I mean. So instead of a BBEG, it's a BBEE. Big Bad Evil Event. And that's the thing everyone's worried about. In fact, my favorite RPG of all time, Band of Blades, is basically the perfect template for a West Marches campaign. It is perfectly designed to run a West Marches campaign inside of it, because the game itself is built around your legion doing missions to build up a number of points for an endgame event. This point system is fantastic and is something that I've lifted from Band of Blades and have put in many of my West Marches campaigns. As for traveling and heading back to base, I think there are two schools of thought here. One, you can have the base be traveling like in Band of Blades, like the Legion is constantly moving and that's where you're coming back to. Or you can have fast travel, like an airship or teleportation beacons. If you go to an area and you place a beacon, you can just teleport right back to that beacon, for instance. Because at least for me, one of the worst parts of a West Marches campaign is retreading old areas that you've cleared out. Sure, it's fun to do once or twice, but other times it just feels kind of meh. So I give players the opportunity to sometimes skip over those things, or to fast travel to certain points to make traveling a little bit quicker, and to make traveling back to home base a lot quicker. Thanks for the great question. Next up, though, combat game balance. How do you do it? 5e is not serviceable in targeting difficulty. How to plan encounters would be great. So I already have 2 videos on this channel about planning encounters. Technically 3, one where I literally walk through how I plan an encounter within 10 minutes. Not a lot of people watch the video, unfortunately, but I can give you a high-level overview of encounter balancing. You use a scale in your comment, and that's a very good way of thinking about it, because it all boils down to how much damage the enemies can do, and how quickly would they take a party out, and how much damage can the party do, and how quickly they can take the enemy out. You're trying to make sure the party can dispatch the enemies before the enemies can dispatch them. Ideally, in a frame of time that's about 3 rounds of combat. After 3 rounds of combat, especially during higher level D&D combats, it really starts to bog down. So at a high level, I have access to my players' character sheets, either just by asking them to send me a picture of their character sheets, or by using an online system like D&D Beyond, where I can just check their stats. I figure out how many hit points they have and what's the average amount of damage a character can do in any given round of combat. And then I add in a round where what's the maximum amount of damage they can do in a round of combat, if they're going all out or using all their abilities. And that gives me a pretty good estimate of what the party is capable of and how much they can withstand, at least at a very basic level. Next, for the enemies, I count up how many hit points they have, and how much damage they are going to do on average per round. As a good rule of thumb, the enemy hit points should be about equivalent to the party hit points. If they are about equivalent, you're off to a great start. Then for an average fight, I'm making sure the enemies do about 1/4 to 1/3 of the party's total hit point number per round in damage. Or for a solo boss fight, the boss is probably going to be doing about half the party's total hit points, because the boss is only one creature, so they have to be doing that amount of damage to make themselves feel threatening to a party. Plus, healing is going to keep party members up anyway, so they'll be fine. And then you just start weighting the scales one way or another. If you have a bunch of random encounters before a boss fight, you drop the enemy health or the enemy damage, and boom, you're good. A less challenging fight that is still going to chip off a few of the party's resources. But there are also, of course, other factors involved, as making a D&D combat is more of an art than a science. You should take into account player abilities, what items they have, the playstyle of your players, what spells your spellcasters have. You could have 300 hit points of goblins, but if the wizard has Fireball, guess what? That 300 hit points is fake. Your wizard is just going to nuke them if they get a chance, so maybe 150 hit points of veteran soldiers would actually be more effective, and more fun for your party to fight. Yeah, it's a lot, I know, but quick rule of thumb, make the party hit points and the enemy hit points match, and then make sure that the enemies are doing about a fourth to a third of the party's total hit points per round. If you want a more dangerous or more deadly combat, you're just going to raise the enemy hit points until you're at the percentage that you want. Beware though, anything higher than about 60% is pretty much a TPK for most parties. That's just an amount of damage that D&D healing can't really stop. Sure, the party can delay their death, but stop it? Probably not. Last questions though. Who is your favorite NPC you have run, and what is the monster you have enjoyed the most to run? And these are hard questions because I've run literally thousands of games across dozens of systems. I think I'm going to cheat a bit on the NPC one because there are two that really stand out in my mind. One was this massive reoccurring villain in my old campaign world, and her name was Thana. I took pride in the fear that players would feel whenever she showed up. Even if she wasn't an antagonist against them in the moment, her very presence was unsettling. And this is partially because with just how powerful and unhinged she was basically an archlich, and she had access to a type of magic that pretty much no other characters had within that universe. Basically, she would straight up destroy souls in order to gain power from them. And she killed a lot of people and had a lot of souls. The reason why she was so fun is at the drop of a hat, she could go from 0 to 1,000. Players who had met Thana before were on eggshells around her, and new players quickly found out that she was not an NPC that should be messed with. Wrapping around to the verisimilitude of the world, all the other NPCs and players feared Thana, and I made sure to continually reinforce that fear. Like, you might have a player who would be like trying to challenge her or would say a snide remark or comment, and at the drop of a hat, a power word kill or a disintegrate would be thrown out, player would die, Thana instantly resurrect them and say, next time I'll make sure you're dead. However, the ways that I described her magic was so alien and weird and violent that players knew that she was way out of their league. And this was intentional because every time Thana appeared, I wanted something bad to happen, or she would do something that would just unsettle them, because honestly, I had a reputation for her that I had to upkeep. Everyone knew across all the campaigns in that particular campaign world that there was everything else and then there was her. And if you had her evil looking down upon you in anger, that was a very bad place to be. But through it all, she had a politeness to her that many players found extremely unsettling. That combined with a directness and a propensity to act really just put tension in whatever scene she was in with the party. The players liked her in the way that you like someone like Hannibal Lecter in film, where you don't like them as a person. They're a terrible person, the most evil. However, just being able to witness and observe them, you never know what they're going to do next, that's interesting, which I think makes a good villain. But on the flip side, I'm also running an NPC in my current campaign world called the Maiden, and she is a glorious ray of sunshine. It's basically my best attempt at making a character that players will love. Basically, even if you don't care about the campaign plot or the world, you would have to be a monster not to care about the Maiden. Her hallmark trait is kindness. She's just a very kind person. This character will go out of her way to help literally anybody, and she will do it in the kindest, most dorky way possible. This character has a bunch of idiosyncrasies, like she really likes frogs, for instance. So players always want to give her frog-themed plushies or books or basically anything just to show their gratification. And always the Maiden takes time to really just be a likable character. She's the character that if I got to meet them, I would probably be happiest, which is why I am ruthless in my torturing of this character. Not just me, but usually when the players do something bad, it somehow spirals back on her in just the worst ways. But I intentionally gave this character the most tragic, of backstories and circumstances. I'm making sure she's going for the title of the most tragic character in fiction. A character that, despite being so pure, so noble, always gets her teeth kicked in. Across many campaigns, oftentimes just due to player error, and her shouldering the burden of their failures. Because you know what? Players are often willing to accept the consequences of their poor decisions, but to have the innocent person, to have the kindest person you know, accept all the punishment and all the fallout for the bad shit you did, mwah, that's beautiful. And this is on top of a backstory that has made grown-ass men cry their eyes out. Because legitimately, with everything that they've done to interact with her, finding out everything that she has been through is heartbreaking. I can't tell the full backstory here because I know some of my players watch these videos, and all of it hasn't been revealed to them yet. But however tragic and sad you think it is, it's likely worse. And it's not even worse in one way where it's like, man, like this thing just keeps on happening to her. It's worse in new and confounding and just brutal ways. It is a buffet of tragedy, and through it all, I love running her. Because for that character to still be kind, that's a nobility that I think that people have, where there are so many people who have endured terrible things in their lives. But yet, when you meet them, they are the kindest people you know. They have every reason to hate the world. They have every reason to give up. But for some reason, well, I think for the reason that they've seen the darkness of the world and they don't want to contribute to it. And I think those people I try to embody in the Maiden, because they are the people that I genuinely admire the most. Where despite all that darkness, there is still light. So yeah, two opposite ends of the spectrum. One, this psychopathic villain that instilled terror into the hearts of the players. Another, a character who is the kindest character I've ever run, who is maybe the most beloved, who also instills fear into the hearts of the players, because all they want to do is protect her, and they are constantly worried that somehow her life is going to get worse. And from just this one character, all the other players are now engaged in the campaign world, because even if they don't care about the story, even if they don't care about 99.9% of the people in the campaign world, they care about the Maiden. And if something bad would happen to her, the world will burn. So yeah, they're my favorite NPCs. And then, what is the monster you have enjoyed the most to run? Again, I've run like thousands of D&D combats. I think I'll limit myself to just 5th edition monsters, because I've run a lot of homebrew monsters over my time, just because I exhausted the monster manual pretty early on. I'm trying to think, because the monsters that I enjoy running most are usually connected to a backstory in some way, or it's just the narrative role they have in a campaign that makes them important. In terms of the actual usage of the monster, how they work out in game, I think I'm probably gonna go with a Nightwalker. I like their vibe, I like their aura, I like their powers, I like that they can potentially kill you. Maybe something like the Marut also comes into play, because just having an attack that automatically hits scares the shit out of players. I don't know, there is a look in a player's eyes when you say, it doesn't even need to roll to hit you, and it just does this much damage. And they look at me and they're like, what kind of homebrewed bullshit is that? And I get to say, no, it's not homebrew at all. It's an official monster stat block. Plus, the Marut just looks like a dork, and I kinda love it. And hey, if you like this video and want to think about supporting the channel some more, consider going over to my Patreon. And if you haven't seen the previous video, you can check it out right here. And thank you for entering the dungeon.